before we get into the policy, you have an urgent question today on this. What's your frustration with Chris Grayling's announcing this via the media?
Well, he's got form, to be honest. He's done this with HS2 and with South East Air Capacity. So it is rather frustrating for people who thought very, very hard about trying to bring sovereignty back to this Parliament wants to do anything other than put statements before the House. Right,
now you've been out on the airwaves criticising today's announcement. But if the plans are so bad, why is Network Rail Chief Executive Mark Carne welcoming them?
Well, I don't suppose he's got much choice as the Chief Executive of Network Rail.
Really?
But you know, Nicola Shaw carried out her own review at the government's behest and didn't come up with this model. And you do ask yourself, why on earth go to all that trouble of doing a very in-depth piece of work simply to abandon its findings and shoehorn something extra in? And you know, I think this is just going to add greater complexity to an already complex and fragmented industry. Wholly unnecessary, and there will be costs involved. And who pays for that? It'll be the taxpayer and a fare-paying passenger yet again. So here we are, just completely wasteful of resources. It's not the right response.
But not everyone in your party agrees with you, because Christian Wolmar, the respected rail journalist, and he knows what he's talking about when it comes to the trains, and your candidate in the recent Richmond Park by-election, says the best railways in the world bring together the network and train operators into companies that operate both. So why couldn't that happen here?
Well, it does, and Deutsche Bahn do that sort of job in Germany, running the infrastructure and the services. And Netherlands Spoorwegen do it, as do Keolis to a very large extent in France. But what we do is simply subsidise their operations back in their home states. And of course we do remember, don't we, what happened with Railtrack and Ladbroke Grove and Potters Bar the last time the private sector was involved in safety and the infrastructure. And we don't want to be going back to those days.
Right, but is that a fair comparison? I mean, you said yourself you don't have a problem then with the network and train operators being brought together into companies. So I say, what is your objection?
Well, it's the fact that the whole focus is about extracting profit and value at every single turn. We have franchisees wasting money on the franchise process, as does the DfT. We've got the operational costs, we've got the transactional costs and the intermeshing of those costs, plus of course the profit margins, which are opaque in the extreme. So there are hundreds of millions of pounds leaking out of our railway system every year into private entities. And why on earth should we, as taxpayers and fare-paying passengers, be subsidising that sort of structure?
Right, just and stay with us, Andy McDonald. I mean, Tim Montgomerie, the point there that Andy McDonald is making, that it's all about focusing on the profit, won't that damage the railways further?
Well, we have an incredibly successful railways industry in the UK. If you look at the station I travel into, Waterloo, before privatisation, about 100,000 people were coming into it every day. Now it's near 250,000 people.
But it can't cope with the numbers of people.
Well, that is why I think this reform is a useful one. There is sometimes a clash between the train operating companies and Network Rail for provision of infrastructure. And now the bringing the two together will mean that the train operating companies can get on with work that they think needs to be done more urgently themselves.
But will they, if they're only looking at profit margins?
I think if they're worried about punctuality and hitting the targets that they have to meet under their franchise agreements, they will take that responsibility more seriously.
Right, let's have a look though at your comparison, Andy McDonald, again to Railtrack, because it isn't exactly the same as what's being proposed by Chris Grayling, because then the issue was subcontracting to private companies, and his proposal is about involving train operating companies in decisions. It's not exactly the same, is it?
Well, I mean, who's going to take responsibility where there's a crossover? If you're getting lines that cross over onto others, HS2 for example, or if there's east-west lines conflicting with north-south lines, who's going to take responsibility for that? You know, is it Network Rail or is it the train operating company? We're just adding more complexity into a system that just doesn't need any more.
Right, why is it adding complexity if you're just bringing them together into joint decision-making? Surely it will actually simplify the whole setup.
Well, I know that's the case that's made, but I think we look at the South West Alliance, where a similar proposition was made, that ultimately collapsed. it did not work out well. So let's look at history, let's look at these alliances, see how they functioned. They haven't. Let's look at Railtrack and see the disaster that they rendered to this nation, and people expressing sadness about bereavements on our railways. We do not want to be there again.
Right. I mean, looking at the new East-West Railway from Oxford to Cambridge that Chris Grayling is focusing on today, this will be privately built and privately run. Do you reject that proposal?
Well, what I do observe is that that's the slippery slope. This is clearly the intention for the entire network. And what we're making abundantly clear is that train operating companies will come back under public ownership as those franchises arise. Now, the case in point, Oxford to Cambridge as a separate and distinct issue, has to stand on its own merits, but the rest of the network will be looking to bring back into public ownership.
Yes, I mean, that's clear, that's Labour policy. But what about this idea that it's the slippery slope towards privatising?
Well,
hang on, Andy, I'm just going to put that to Tim Montgomerie and I'll come back to you.
Well, look, there are many companies, Richard Branson's Virgin Trains network, they're very popular with customers. I think it is a shame that Labour still have this, private sector bad, public sector good mantra. We saw with Jeremy Corbyn's famous train journey when he was sat on the train when actually there were seats vacant. There is a negativity towards private trains still in the Labour Party that's unjustified and doesn't celebrate the fact that our railways now in Britain carry these extra passengers and are one of the safest in the world. The safety record on our railway network is beyond comparison to almost every other nation in the world.
Do you accept that, Andy McDonald?
Well, thank goodness it is a safe railway system. Well, let's look at some of the incidents that have occurred in Harlington and Hayes and elsewhere,
sure,
where people have been dragged down the platforms. We don't want to see an increase in
no,
incidents,
of course, no one wants
and we
to see an
don't want
increase.
to compromise on safety.
No one wants to see an increase. But hang on,
And the private sector have got a record of doing this, and that's exactly what will happen on this occasion, because profit will triumph and trump over safety on every occasion in the private sector.
Let me just pick you up on those things. So at the moment, you are saying that there is a good safety record on the railways as it stands, but you think that more privatisation or private money or private funding will automatically lead to more tragic accidents?
We know that this is the case because the last time this experiment was conducted, that's exactly the outcome that we had with Railtrack. We know of the catalogue of disasters that occurred.
Except you've admitted this isn't exactly like Railtrack.
Well, it's another modification.
Right.
I
but it's
grant
not the
you
same.
that. I grant you that it's a modification of the same principle, but it's a starting point, and we know the ideology of this Secretary of State. We know exactly where he wants to be.
Right, but you're being ideological. I suppose arguably you're being ideological on the other side, rightly or wrongly.
No, absolutely.
So
it's
ideology
about having the
is getting
ideology.
right. Well, okay, but if ideology is wrong per se or getting in the way of running good railways,
politics is a good thing. You've got to have the right conviction.
Okay,
about the
fine.
right
So you're
politics.
happy for the ideology if it's your ideology, but you think obviously the government's ideology is wrong. And I understand. Yeah, and I understand your point there. But if we're looking to simplify the railways and keep them safe, wouldn't it be better to see if these changes work? You've already made up your mind that they won't, before pushing ahead with what would be a quite disruptive and complicated renationalisation programme.
Well, no, not a complicated privatisation system. That's what's being proposed of Network Rail.
But your proposal is a renationalisation programme.
Nicholas Shaw talked about route-based businesses. Now, they have gone a long way towards through the benchmarking process to bring that to fruition. Or I would put it the other way. Why on earth do we not let those changes bed down and let's see what the benefits are? It may be that people are very content with what comes out of that process.
All right, Andy McDonald, thank you very much.